Typically, the videos in this series correspond directly to the material that we've been covering in Sunday school lessons. This month is slightly different. Instead, we're going to answer a question that came up, which is, what is the Apocrypha? I think it's actually a very good question to ask and a simple one to answer, and it's useful for you to understand exactly what the Apocrypha is. The answer to this is surprisingly simple and straightforward. It goes back to the Old Testament and the fact that historically the Old Testament was translated in many languages, but there are two kind of major languages in which the Old Testament is preserved. One is Hebrew, and the second is Greek. The Greek version is often referred to as the Septuagint, and this included everything that was in the Hebrew version plus some additional books. So the Old Testament that we use in the LDS Church today, the King James Version of the Old Testament that we use, includes the books that were in the Hebrew version of the Old Testament. The Apocrypha is simply those books that were found in the Septuagint, that is the Greek translation, but not in the Hebrew version. A place that you can easily read more about this is the Bible Dictionary under the entry Apocrypha. It's very useful, it provides a summary of some of the books, and I encourage you to do that. A more complete answer is understood by knowing some key dates. The first is that the Greek translation of the Old Testament was created roughly in the 3rd century BC in Alexandria by Jews who were living there at the time. Several centuries later, in the 4th century AD, Jerome translates the Bible, Old Testament and New Testament, into Latin. This is known as the Vulgate. In doing so, when he translates the Old Testament, he shows a preference for the Hebrew translation of the Old Testament. The books that are listed in the Septuagint only, so these are the books that subsequently become known as the Apocrypha, he still translates them, but lists them separately at the end of the book. During the Reformation in the 1500s, Christians are trying to decide what will be included as canonical books. Which books are they going to recognize as part of the Bible? Catholics at that point decide that it should include the Apocrypha. By contrast, most Protestants choose not to include the Apocrypha. Even at that point, though, when the King James Version is first printed, it's translated in 1600, and shortly after 1600, and most, or rather all of the King James versions that are printed include a copy of the Apocrypha, so those books are printed. However, in the late 1600s, they start to bind, or rather print, some of the Bibles while excluding the Apocrypha. About 100 years later, there's actually a very substantial increase in the exclusion of the Apocrypha from newly printed Bibles. Starting in 1826, the Apocrypha is actually no longer being included in newly printed versions of the Bible. That is, in the new King James versions of the Bible that are printed. Now that's important. Notice that date, 1826. The church is formed just 4 years later. So many of the early converts some of them would have had Bibles that predated that period, 1826, and so would have included the Apocrypha, while other members would have relatively new Bibles that didn't include the Apocrypha. So even among the membership of the church, early members of the church, some of them would have had copies of the Bible that included the Apocrypha, while others would have copies that did not include the Apocrypha. So it makes a lot of sense when Joseph Smith is translating the Bible, he has a question about whether he should translate the Apocrypha. And this, of course, is the basis for the revelation he receives in section 91. Finally, a few other notes about the Apocrypha. First, you can find a list of the major books and really a summary of what's in those books in the Bible Dictionary under the entry Apocrypha. I encourage you to read that. Second, it's still recognized by several Christian churches as part of the Bible, as canonical, the Catholics and several Eastern Orthodox churches. The final thing I just want to note, just so you're familiar with the term, sometimes it is referred to in the Catholic Church as being deuterocanonical, which just literally means the second canon. So this is a term that you'll hear in reference to the Apocrypha.